what are your recollections on going on the troop ship over to France for starters?
Oh, the troop ship on the way to it wasn't to France, it was to Scotland actually. I was terribly excited. It was my first ocean trip, and I found it just beautiful and romantic, and watching the seaweed go by and the seabirds flying around, and there were ships quite a ways off, but within view, of course, of naval ships that were guarding us because there was still U-boat problems going across the ocean. But you felt sort of secure with these boats on either side. You figured if there's a U-boat, they're going to take care of it before it gets to you. The whole idea of that first ocean trip was just a great romantic experience. I loved every minute of it. And when we got to Scotland, immediately it was dark. We went. It was the Firth of Forth where we landed, and it was dark. And the next day, we were then shipped to Dover, I guess it was, to go across to France on a train with all the shades pulled down. I felt I was in an Agatha Christie movie. And this mysterious thing, I didn't know where we were. And the only thing I remember was of a bridge at the Firth of Forth. No, sorry, it was the Firth of Clyde. Firth of Clyde, which was very much like the Firth of Forth, that I'd heard about just as romantic words. And we get to the White Cliffs of Dover, which we were all singing at that time. We knew the White Cliffs of Dover from "There'll be bluebirds over the White Cliffs of Dover," etc., etc. It was very romantic and exciting. And then from there, we took these landing boats going over to France, which was not dangerous anymore because this was after the D-Day. So the beaches were all cleared. The Germans were pretty much cleared out of most of France by this time. And so it was an adventure. I loved it because I had to go through the same motions that I had seen in the movies of the men landing at D-Day. I had to climb down from it was from a large ship. I forgot a large ship. I had to climb down this rope ladder, and of course the channel is typical channel. The waves were 20 feet high, going up and down. And I remember climbing down the ladder and expecting to put my foot down into the landing craft, and just at that moment the ship went up another 20 feet. And it was scary, but a marvelous adventure for. By that time, I guess I was 20, and and then getting into the landing boat just as the other soldiers did, and the landing boat comes up to the shore, but can't get up to the shore, so you have to wade through the water to get onto the beach, and I felt myself, without being shot at that point, going through the same motions that I'd seen these romantic images. So it was very exciting. We were in France. We tried to a few Frenchmen tried to speak to us. I didn't speak French at that time. Nobody else did around me. We were there for a few days, and then we were loaded into a truck, which at the time I didn't know what kind of a truck it was. It was an open truck with just benches on each side. And the soldiers were all sitting there with their rifles between their knees, looking very nervous. I was excited. I couldn't sit. I stood. I turned around and I was hanging on to the side of the truck, looking at the landscape. which of course was the same road that the invaders, the Allied invasion, had taken. So everything was bombed out, devastated. And I was seeing this with my own eyes, where before it was only pictures in the newspapers. And I was glued to the side of that truck. And then we passed Reims Cathedral. And I had already didn't know I was going to be an architect, but I was already interested in architecture. And I had a funny teenage book on cathedrals of Europe, which I had studied over and over again. So I recognized it. And I was in seventh heaven, passing this in the evening and twilight, passing this cathedral. A little bit shot up, but still magnificent. And we arrive at the front. And at the front, you start hearing what I call the noises of war. Explosions, machine guns, the American machine guns that went pop, 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 pop. The German machine guns that went brrrr, and so on. And, you know, even their artillery was much faster and more devastating. But you hear all these noises. You know that you're in the war at this point. I was terribly excited. And there was an older man who was about older. He was 40. A little delicate man who was just pale. And he said to me, listening to the sounds, he said, "This is real." And I said, "Yeah." And then I thought to myself, what a stupid thing I had said. The guy was scared. He was suffering. And I should have comforted him instead of talking about how excited I was to be at the front. And then he was sent back that night because he had a nervous breakdown. He was sent away. And that guilt remained with me for the rest of my life. I'll just jump ahead to getting to the front, and it was actually inside Germany. I know because the name of the town was Prüm, P-R-U umlaut with an M, and I've looked at it on the map, and it's definitely a German city, German town, an agricultural town. And I experienced in that house, I'm not going to go into all the stories, but I experienced my first artillery barrage in that house. And there's a story that goes with it because it was a tiny little farmhouse of four rooms. And in one corner room, which was originally the kitchen of the house, some of my predecessors, a day or two before, I don't know when, had piled it with ammunition. It was like a little ammunition dump. And I looked at it and I said, gee, that's strange, when looking out the window was the front. And I could see the German front on the other side. Couldn't see them, but I knew that was the German line, and there was the no man's land between us. And I said, these guys can see us. And they put all the ammunition right on that side of the house. Sure enough, there's a barrage. And I huddle into a little corner. And then it's over, and there was a sergeant in another room, and he called over, he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And it's over, and I went into the kitchen, and a piece of the corner of the house had been blown away. But the ammunition was intact. That was my first experience. Okay. Then I get sent to the front, which was in the Ardennes forest. And we were digging in because there was that stalemate from September until December of 1944. And I meet this wonderful young man who was only 1 year older than I, and it was so beautiful. The forest, living in the forest. It's like camping out in a beautiful forest on the side of a hill. And we were built our bunkers into the hill and just had to build a front, which we did. We cut down logs and made a sort of a log cabin front. And in a tiny little space, we just had enough space for a triple-decker bunk. And, oh no, it was a double-decker bunk. But there were three of us in there. So anyway, there were bunks for the three of us, and just a little place for a little desk where we could write letters and a kerosene lamp. That was it. But it was so romantic. So what was our job? We had to wake up. We had to spell each other every 2 hours to stand guard outside, especially at night. And of course, the noises of war continued. There were constant explosions that you heard, constant machine gunning, constant rifle fire, and so on, just without a stop. And there was one German gun that, when it shot, because there was a valley, we were looking down a valley from where we were, it echoed, so that when they shot it, when a shell was shot out of this gun, which was originally supposed to be an anti-aircraft gun, and they decided to use it against us, against these ground troops. So it was very fast. It really went very fast. It went boom, da-da, and bang, you know, that's how fast it was. And I'm standing guard there, and I hear this thing going, boom, da-da, boom, da-da. And in my head, and because I'm already writing poetry about the stars and being away from home and seeing the same stars that I saw and around another curve of earth and blah, 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 all kinds of fancy poetry that I'm writing while I'm supposed to be standing guard. And I hear this boom-ta-ta, and then I start to sing from the percussion of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I hum to myself, boom ta ta, boom ta 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 ta. That was my romantic teenage head responding to the terribilità of war. I think it's normal. I don't know. I was very romantic, indeed. Okay, we're there for a while. And really, it was like a beautiful camping trip for three months. I underwent barrages, and at one point I was supposed to be repairing a telephone line that continued from the headquarters all around to our troops in the company. And a barrage came over while I was in the middle of the woods there, alone. And it exploded very close to me because I was showered with debris. But already I was getting used to it. And as soon as it was over, I continued on and finished my work. And then December comes, and something we expected all along. We had the order to attack. So that's a different story. And everybody's a little bit nervous and so on, naturally. And they send in a bunch of young kids. And here, I was only in the war for 3 months, but already a veteran. And these kids come in, they sent them in so fast that they weren't wearing battle fatigues. They were wearing their uniforms, their dress uniforms, with neckties. And they had helmets. That's about it. And they seemed so young to me. Well, they were probably around 2 or 3 years younger than I was at that point. And, by November 44, I was 21. So, and they're scared to death, these kids. By this time, they broke my heart. So I was very nice to them. I told them what we were doing there and what they would have to do. And I was very envious of them because we had built these nice bunkers and enjoyed 3 months camping in the Ardennes forest. And these kids were taking over us, and we were going into battle. What we didn't know was that the Germans, I don't know what the intelligence was at the time, whether we knew the Germans were getting ready to attack or they knew we were getting ready to attack, but we were both getting ready to attack at the same time. So we take off. My captain leads us off into some other part of the Ardennes. I don't remember. It's very hard to be oriented in the middle of a forest. And the Germans called it the Eifel. That was their word for that mountainous part of the Ardennes forest. And I discover after we leave that all those kids who took our place were right in the middle of the German attack, and most of them, probably all of them, were massacred. One of the first emotional blows that one has. There we are in the forest, and then the captain tells us, early in the morning, it must have been 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't know, tells us to take off our packs, and he picks out two privates, myself and another one, and says, stay here with the packs, and we'll send a jeep for you, and you'll pile all the packs on the jeep, and you'll meet us, and the jeep will take you to where we are. So, okay, the two of us are waiting there, and after 3 months, we were getting so used to the idea that I did know where the orientation was. I knew where north, south, east, and west were. You get used to the idea that all the noises, the constant firing, is coming from the east. And we're sitting there waiting for this jeep, which doesn't arrive. And it sounds as if the noises are coming from the south. And couldn't figure this out. We didn't know that the Germans were attacking. And and quite loud. Seemed awfully close. Rumbling and noises and shooting. So the other fellow says, I can't take it. I'm gonna walk out and see what's happening out there, because there's something funny going on. So I'm left alone in the Ardennes, listening to this rumbling going by and this firing of all kinds of arms. And I'm getting hungry. So I look around, and some of the guys had thrown away their K-rations. And in the K-rations, there was something I always liked, crackers and chocolate powder to make cocoa. But it was winter, and there was always snow on the ground. So I concocted a chocolate sorbet by taking in my tin cup, my canteen cup, putting in snow, putting the powder in and mixing it up, and having chocolate sorbet. And so I'm sitting there eating my crackers and sorbet, and my buddy comes rushing back and says, the Germans have attacked, our company has been devastated, and we've got to get the hell out of here. So we he knew the path, and he takes me out through the path which I didn't know, and we arrive at I can't think of the words now. A place where the soldiers gather.
Garrison.
What?
Garrison?
A garrison. A garrison was an old Belgian garrison from the First World War, maybe before that, and had been already taken over by the Nazis, and now the Nazis had been pushed out, and we were back in there, so it was now in our hands, but it was being shelled continuously. And I don't know, I got attached, I don't remember how. There was a sergeant who, to keep busy, I guess, I don't know. Maybe he had been ordered to do this. We had all these packs of these that the soldiers had left behind. He said, we have to take all these packs apart and organize the stuff again. You know, all it's in the canteens in one place and all of this in that place and the packs somewhere else and so on and so forth. And their private things in another pile. So it was a heartbreaking job, but it kept us busy all day so that we paid no attention to the explosions exploding all around us. The place was chaotic. It was a place where trucks were coming in. Trucks were supposed to be bringing in materiel and food and supplies to the front. They had been doing this for 3 months. But the front was now a battleground. So I saw these. And in those days, the black soldiers weren't allowed to be on in battle. They used to put them to work driving trucks and stuff like that. So I remember this one black guy driving this big truck toward the front. And I said to myself, where is he going? And about a half hour later, I see him tootling back. And the shelling continues all into the evening. The sergeant and I are exhausted. I get into my sleeping bag. And there was a little building there. There was a flimsy building. And I'm in the bag, and I was thinking to myself, you know, if I have to get out of this bag in the middle of the night, it's going to be difficult. I really shouldn't be in a bag. And I felt myself starting to shiver. And I remember asking myself, am I shivering because I'm afraid? Or because it's cold, and it was cold? Or is it just because I'm so tired? I remember asking myself that question. Anyway, we survived to the next day, and the next day, my captain and his sergeant, with whom I had been working, survived and came into the garrison, and I saw them. And I was so excited about seeing him alive. I ran over to him, and I shook his hand. And I said, oh, I'm so glad to see you, and so on. He looked very haggard and pale and exhausted. And I forgot to say the same thing to the sergeant. And they left. And the sergeant gave me a look when he left. Another emotional event which wasn't directly involved with being in the war, and so on. But it's a human event which lasted with me at least as long as some of the terrible things that I had to endure under fire. And that's another of the emotional things that's so interesting, that I could be romantic and write poetry and sing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to the tune of artillery fire. And also that it affected me so much that I didn't behave properly with my buddies. It's another aspect of war experience. Ask another question, because that's about it for the Battle of the Bulge. But I'll add another thing. I don't know. Yes, I'll add something else. The thing is, this was now, and I don't remember how I got out of the garrison, but I got attached to some other group. I think it was then that I got attached to this reconnaissance group, and I was no longer in this company. But I realized that I had just escaped being captured 3 times. Once because we left just before the German attack, and the other poor kids who took my place were massacred. Maybe they were captured. I don't know. The second time, I was in the forest there when the tanks that were rumbling through, and the tanks were coming, there were pathways through the forest that were able to take tanks. That's how they knew what they were doing, of course. And they wanted to push their way all the way into Belgium and push the Allies out of Belgium up to Antwerp, and Hitler thought that they would then be on their way back into France. So they were rumbling by me, and the only thing that kept me from being captured or killed was the fact that they didn't have ground troops flanking these tanks that I heard rumbling by. And I had no idea what they were. I just heard the rumbling, which was very loud. It must have been very close. So that was the second time. And the third time was that that garrison where I was, that they failed to retake the garrison. Because if they had managed to retake that garrison, I would have been captured. And it came into my head, what do the Germans do with Allied soldiers who are Jewish? And I thought to myself, they'll know right away. First of all, my name, my the condition of my private part. On top of that, we all wore dog tags with our religion stuck on it, stamped into it. H for Hebrew, C for Christian, and I imagine I for Islam, although in those days there were very few Muslims in America in those days. But they still had, because I've seen cemeteries where the Muslims just had a shaft, a civil shaft, which is typical of a Muslim monument. Sometimes they put a turban on top of it. And of course the Christian one is a cross, and the Jewish one is a Star of David. And that was the reason that we were wearing these dog tags, so that grave diggers would know what to put over our heads when we were buried in some military cemetery. So ask me another question. I think I'll go on to something else. I could go on. I don't know if you want to. All right. We were told before going overseas, and certainly when we got there, that we were not supposed to fraternize with the Germans. If we came across Germans, to disregard them and not speak to them, and so on and so forth. Well, of course that was impossible. First of all, when I was at the front before the Battle of the Bulge, our airplanes were dropping leaflets on the German lines with a little message, which they called in German a Passierschein, a kind of passport. And it said, if you pick this up and take it with you and surrender to the American troops or Canadian. We were right next to the Canadian Army. They will treat you well, and you will be a prisoner of war, but you will be out of the war. Well, sure enough, 2 of them showed up. And I don't remember exactly where it was. I know it was in some building. It was not the same one where the artillery knocked off a corner of that arsenal that we had there. And there were these 2 guys, a young kid, about 15, nice-looking kid, blonde, blue-eyed, Aryan-looking kid, and an older man in his 40s, and looked like an old farmer. And they had escaped with their stuff. And somebody yells out, "Does anybody here speak German?" Well, I had not said a word about the fact that I had studied some German in school before getting into the Army. When I was in high school, my buddies in high school were all studying French or Spanish, which was typical in American schools. And French was very important in those days. That was the international language, the lingua franca, it was called. And I had to study something else. I said, well, we're in a war with Germany. I really ought to study German. So I studied 2 years in high school, and I had 1 semester of German at Harvard before being drafted. So I spoke some German, not a lot, but enough to be able to have a conversation, be understood, and to understand what people were saying to me. But I never reported it. I think that if I had reported it before going to the overseas, they would have sent me to Japan instead of sending me to Germany, because that's the way they did things. If you spoke Japanese, they sent you to Germany. If you spoke German, they sent you to Japan. It's some wild notions that they had. We've had the same crazy thing happen in the Iraq War, where nobody who spoke Arabic was sent there. The army is mad. Well, I raised my hand, and I was told, according to the Geneva Convention, you don't interrogate the prisoners. You just ask them for their name, rank, and serial number. And I remember looking at this 15-year-old scared kid who later on reminded me of our own soldiers who were only a little bit older and looked the same, also scared to death. And the old man could barely contain a satisfied grin that he'd gotten out of the war. And I remember admiring, they weren't wearing helmets, they were wearing their caps, and admiring the cap because it looked so much more stylish and more practical than our caps. Everything the Germans did seemed advanced, more advanced. The Jeep, which was later on the Volkswagen, was much better than our Jeeps. Their artillery was much more rapid and more devastating than ours. When we sent over mortars, we sent them 1 at a time. They put them 6 at a time in like a pipe of pan. And they attached whistles to them so that when they came across, they shrieked like banshees. And we used to call them screaming Mimis. They did everything. They were more advanced than we were, as we discovered after the war, because we went into space because we learned things from the German space scientists. At any rate, so I become the battalion interpreter, because nobody in the whole battalion spoke German. And that made it very interesting, because as we went across Germany, they'd try to billet us at farmhouses and so on every once in a while to let us rest and get a night's sleep and so on. And there usually were, the farm ladies were usually still there with maybe with children or something. The men were all off in the war. Well, since I spoke German, of course I fraternized with them and chatted with them and became friends with them. And they did all sorts of they showed me interesting things and so on. One lady even she asked for a couple of soldiers to come into her house. She wants to entertain them. She has a couple of teenage daughters, and she'll chaperone them. And she wants us to meet them and to be in her house. So she taught me all kinds of... I went with another guy who didn't speak German. The poor guy was sitting there, didn't know what was going on. But I was chatting away, learning these songs, which I still know, and which, of course, I sang in my monologue, including Lily Marlene, which we all knew at that time. And then another lady who was living alone, and quite friendly, and she was making little tidbits for me, little German tidbits which she could make with whatever stuff, the food stuff she had. Of course, she was on a farm, so she had more than people in the cities had. And at one point, a flight of B-24s came over. So we all ran out to sea, and they were in formation. This is something I could never understand, why they come in formation when we were always told on the ground never to go in formation in battle, because if we're in formation, they can wipe us all out with one stroke. Planes come out in formation. And, of course, flak starts immediately. And some of the planes get hit, and we're watching them get hit and start to fall. And we knew that there were usually about 7 crew members. So we'd count the parachutes to see if there were 7 parachutes. And sometimes maybe there were, but most of the time there were not 7, and sometimes there were none. So you can imagine how we felt when we were looking at this. It's just a small group of us. And at one point, I turned around, and my German lady was behind me, grinning triumphantly. And it suddenly occurred to me that she was the enemy. On another occasion, we come to a beautiful little cottage in the woods. Some woods, it wasn't the Ardennes, it was deep into Germany. And it's the cottage of some German businessman, and he's there with his wife and daughter with nice blonde braids tied around her head, nice typical German Jungfrau, and we're billeted there in that house, and they graciously, or they were ordered to go down into their playroom downstairs and live downstairs, because they had it downstairs. And at one point, the man, of course I was already speaking German, so the man comes rushing upstairs and comes over to me and he says, "This is terrible. You've got to tell your officer that one of your soldiers took my cuckoo clock and wrapped it up to take home with him." So, of course, we were taught not to loot. Don't loot. It's a no-no. What the soldiers called looting, they called it liberation. Most of the time, what they liberated were abandoned places. And what they looted was of little value, just souvenirs, really. But this kid, whoever he was, wrapped up. So I went to the officer and I told him that. And he nodded, and I figured he wasn't going to do anything. And then I was so angry with myself because I wanted to scream at this Nazi. I wanted to scream. Why should I care about your fucking cuckoo clock when I and my buddies are fighting and dying in this fucking war that you started and you've managed to avoid? And I've hated myself ever since for not screaming at him these words, which were only left in my head. I think I'll jump to another story, toward the end of the war, where now the war is going very fast. We're just rushing to the Czech border. We didn't go in a straight line, obviously. It was up to Göttingen and around, down to Leipzig, so on and so forth. And in Leipzig, I saw the first civilians walking around in a city. And especially, I remember seeing one young woman, nicely dressed, or sort of sexily dressed, I should say, walking along. And I say, what is she doing? The war is still on. And we've just invaded this city. And she's walking along as if it was every day. It was only later on that it occurred to me that she was a prostitute who was out for business, for the new business that was coming in. But that was another story. We're rushing to the German border, and all of a sudden, on the road where we're supposed to take, a big parade, a big line of German refugees escaping from the Russians are coming to give themselves up to us, which they thought was safer. And the men are all in uniform. And the women are also, they were women, but they're also wearing khakis. And it turns out that it was a headquarters company that just the commander said, let's get out of here, pack up all your stuff, and we're going to go on the road. They came with a few trucks, but not enough to carry everybody. So most of them were walking, most of them carrying valises, sacks over their shoulders and stuff. And they arrive, and the war is still on, and these guys are in uniform. They had to be processed as prisoners of war or something. So I don't know who gave the order, but somebody gives the order. They set up a temporary desk somewhere so these people could come and register who they were and why they were on the road and so on and so forth. And somebody comes over to me, one of the officers, and says, tell them all that they should throw all their packs on the trucks. They had about 2 trucks, I think, onto the trucks so they can line up at this desk. So I said to them in German, gave the order, I said, das Gepäck auf den Lastwagen, das Gepäck auf den Lastwagen. And they came and they threw their sacks and their valises and stuff onto the trucks and went over to line up to be registered at this desk. And we took off for the Czech border. We arrive at the Czech border, and unbeknownst to us, because we were on the road, we didn't have radios to listen to what was going on or the news or anything. When we get to the Czech border, it was the day the war was over in Europe. It was the day of the surrender of the Germans. So where previously, all across Germany, the only thing we ever saw on roads were empty houses with white sheets hanging and no people, because the people were all hiding somewhere. They didn't want to be seen. They thought they might be shot by us as we came through. We get to the Czech border, and it's a victory parade with everybody happy and crying out and waving, crying out Nazdar, Nazdar, which is like what we would say, hail, hail, like welcome. That's quite welcome. It's more like our Latin word, hail to the, good health to you is really what hail is, ave, or ave, whatever they used to shout in Latin times. And And they're waving these colorful flags, blue, white, and red flag of the Czech Republic. And so it was a tremendously emotional experience. It was hard to keep from crying. We get to Pilsen, and we didn't know this, but the Yalta Conference had divided up where the Russians would come and where the Allies would come. So the Russians were to take Prague, the big city. We were to take Pilsen, which was further west, the place of Pilsner beer. It was a rather well economically upscale place. And everybody wants to billet us. Oh, they want to have them. They come. We have a room. Oh, we have this. We send them to stay with us and so on. So I wind up in a little apartment house of a young couple who were not more than 30 that I could imagine, and who owned this little apartment house with a few apartments. And they had an empty apartment. They didn't speak English. I didn't speak Czech, but they spoke at least as much German as I did. So we had a wonderful conversation. And at one point, then they piled me up with little souvenirs and things and to take home, which I had. I still have some of them. Some of them I've lost, but it doesn't matter. And at one point, the young woman says to me, "There's going to be a victory dance at the railroad station. Perhaps you'd like to go." So I said, "Oh, fine." I didn't think it was probably that same evening, probably. So I tootled over. She told me where the station was, and I tootled over there. It turned out to be an elevated station. And I walked up the stairs, and I heard this scratchy music on an old Victrola. And I go up there, and there's a pathetic little circle of girls dancing around in some circle dance, some Middle Eastern, Middle European circle dance. And among them is this kind of hefty girl. Quite pretty, but lots of flesh on her. And blonde, long blonde hair, blue eyes. Looks kind of tough. And she looks at me from the circle. And she leaves the circle, comes over to me, and says in German, "Ich kenne dich, I know you." "You know me? How do you know me?" She says, "Do you see what I'm wearing?" And she was wearing khaki shirt and a khaki skirt, which looked a hell of a lot like a German uniform to me. And she says, "Do you see what I'm wearing? That's all I own. You told me to put all my things on the truck, and the next morning everything was gone." Obviously, the Germans who were nearby were watching all this from their viewpoints, and they saw all these guys coming from a headquarters company where they were well-fed and well-clothed and everything, and they threw all their stuff on the truck. So in the middle of the night, they came and took it all away. So then she says to me, "Du bist Jude? Are you a Jew?" So I say, "Ja, ich bin Jude." I thought I was being attacked by the beast of Belsen herself. And then she says to me, "So am I." So, of course, obviously I was skeptical. And she says, "I'll prove it to you." And she proceeds to recite in perfect European Hebrew. And you know, there are two different pronunciations of Hebrew. There's Ashkenazic Hebrew. Ashkenazic, which means German Hebrew, or German pronunciation of Hebrew. And Sephardic. Sephardi is the Hebrew word for Spain, for Spanish pronunciation. It's the Spanish pronunciation which the Israelis adopted, and that's what they speak, the pronunciation they use today. But Ashkenazic Hebrew is the one that we all learned. And she recites the central prayer. It's not quite a prayer, it's a sort of a exclamation of the devotion to God that comes out of Deuteronomy, where God says, you should love me with all your heart and with all your might, and so on and so forth. It also appears in the New Testament. And she recites the whole thing in beautiful pronunciation. So I realized that she was right. And she tells me her story. Earlier, well, about a year, no, it was a year before, a whole year before, when the Germans were finally doing their final roundups in 1944. And she lived in the Sudetenland, which was really part of Germany, which was given to Czechoslovakia after the First World War, but still had a German population. After the Second World War, they gave it, well, no, when Hitler came in, he took it over, and it was part of Germany again. After the Second World War, I think they gave it back to Czechoslovakia. But anyway, and then the Czechs drove all the Germans out, and the Germans were all up in the air that they were treated so badly by the Czechs. But that's life and war. So she spoke German perfectly. She happened to be blonde, blue-eyed, with very Aryan features. She was rounded up with a lot of other people, and she was with a girlfriend. They were on the same truck that I had been taken to the front in, a truck with just 2 benches on each side. Most of them were all, the Jews were all packed into it, so most of them were standing. They were all standing, probably. And she resolved with her girlfriend to jump off the truck in the middle of the night. If there's any time that it slows down a little bit, they will jump off, which they did. And they stayed along the side of the road all night. They had their handbags with them. So they had combs and some makeup. So they combed their hair, put on some makeup, and started to walk back from where they had been taken. And on the way, a couple of German soldiers come their way. So they, hi, in German, they chatted. They both spoke perfect German, and they flirted around. And the soldier said to them, "Where are you going?" "Oh, we're going into town to look for jobs. Maybe there's some jobs there we can find." So they said, we're part of a headquarters company, and they're looking for cooks. Maybe you could come. Why don't you come and apply? So they did, and they got the jobs. And for over a year, or for at least a year, they stuffed themselves with the food that they were cooking for their German Nazi saviors. I imagine, I didn't see the other girl, but the other girl probably was also just as filled up and fat by this time. So she told me that she's going to go back and find her home and look for her mother. I already knew, I don't know, we didn't know very much about what was happening during the Holocaust, but I already knew that if she was taken away, her mother surely would have been taken away. And her house would no longer be her house. Maybe not even existing. I don't know. But I didn't say anything. And then we talked all night. And it was, dawn was breaking, and I said, "Oh, I've got to be back at 7. My outfit is leaving. I've got to be back, and we're taking off for somewhere. I didn't know where." So she accompanied me back to this apartment house, And I said goodbye to her, and I run upstairs, hoping my buddies were still sleeping. No, when I get upstairs, they're all packed, all dressed. My sleeping bag is still on the floor, and I walk in fully clothed. So they look at me. They had been out probably drinking some Pilsner beer. But I was out all night with doing something. But they were surprised because they knew I was that type. But they didn't say anything. We all rushed down to the Jeep, piled onto the Jeep. There is Alice. Her name was Alice. Alice Schwartz, her name was. Alice Schwartz. She's standing there like Lily Marlene near the door and waving to me, waving goodbye. And these guys look at her and they look at me and they don't say anything, and we take off. Well, you know, I wasn't in the Holocaust, but I spent the whole night talking to this girl who had escaped from it. Besides the fact that I discovered afterward, only recently, to tell the truth, only a few years ago, from a Canadian program where they found 2 Canadian Jewish soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge and were captured by the Nazis. And they told their story. They said all the Jewish Canadian soldiers and American soldiers were all separated from the others. The non-Jewish ones were sent to be taken care of by the Geneva Convention. The Jewish ones were marched from Belgium across Germany to Poland, to Auschwitz. And these 2 guys were in Auschwitz only. They were taken prisoner early in January, and or maybe the end of December, whenever it was. And Auschwitz was liberated in May, so they were only there for about 5 months. And somebody took a picture of them, and after those 5 months, they were the skeletons that we have seen of concentration camp prisoners. They were barely alive. They managed to come back to Canada, and they survived. And they were my age. And I discovered what would have happened to me at least 3 times if I had been captured by these. I discovered that I was a candidate for Auschwitz. I, an American, had nothing to do with Europe. I wasn't a European Jew. And yet, I was that close to the Holocaust. Well, of course, that affected me. I'll tell another story about the Holocaust. In this little reconnaissance group that I was in, just a lieutenant and a sergeant and two privates. So there were just 4 of us, I guess, in a Jeep. And we used to go out doing reconnaissance work. And I think I told you that we'd go out on the Autobahn to see if it was mined or if any snipers were shooting and so on. And we went as far as we dared and then came back to report that the road seemed to be clear and so on, so that the troops could move ahead. One of the jobs that we had was also, after the troops moved through, to inspect abandoned trucks, abandoned railroad cars. So one of my jobs, and especially if there was a hole at a railroad yard that we'd come across, to go from boxcar to boxcar, sliding open the doors, climbing in, looking around, if there's anything in there or not. Most of the time they were empty. Once we found, I'm not sure whether it was in a boxcar or in a truck, we found a load of Luger pistols. That's all I remember finding of any value. But the boxcars were spotlessly clean. And I was puzzled. I said, I'd go from boxcar, I was sliding open the doors, climbing in, sliding back. And I said, why are they cleaning up these empty trains and then escaping from us? Are they trying to show us how efficient they are? How clean they are? How tidy they are? That's all I could think of. I said, it's strange that they're showing off to us that they're tidy people. It was only after the war that I realized what those boxcars were. They had come back from the death camps, and they were full of shit and piss and vomit and every other horror. And the Germans had carefully hosed them down for their next trip back to the death camps. And I was in those boxcars, not knowing what their intention was. And as a matter of fact, there's certain things that I've forgotten, but I know that on the way back to France, when we were supposed to get on an ocean liner to go back to the States and back to Texas and be remustered to go to Japan, I rode with by this time I was a staff sergeant, and I rode with a couple of officers, just the three of us, in an empty boxcar. I was sitting on the floor, and we joked all the way. I had a wonderful time, and I was kind of a little proud too to be an enlisted man hanging around with officers, at the age of 22 or whatever I was at the time. And and it wasn't until after the war that I realized that those were those infamous boxcars. And I began to see photographs, movies of the SS men pushing the people sliding the doors open, pushing the people into the boxcars, sliding them shut, pushing them into the next thing, and sliding them shut. And I remembered the sound of that sliding them open and sliding them shut, and sliding them open and sliding them shut. And that planted a piece of iron in my heart to this very day. When they opened the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I went to see it, and the people who designed it deliberately put a boxcar on the path that you had to follow, so that you had to walk through the boxcar. And I walked through that boxcar. That's it.